I think I've got a sort of a world record here as the first person at the Ministry of Sound to wear a tie on stage, and I'm really proud of that. I think in a way, though, me wearing a tie is an interesting way to introduce this subject because, you know, journalists are not real commercial or employee type people. In reality, we are going around calling people, asking them to tell us things they shouldn't tell us, asking them to break even the rules of their own companies in the hopes that there's some kind of a story there. From early in my career, I always started wearing a tie because I wanted to kind of blend in and seem like I was a safe person to have around in these companies. And so far it's worked. It was something I did a lot at the Wall Street Journal, and people would think, oh, you're wearing a tie, you must be sort of a finance person like us. But in reality, we're not like that at all. We're gossipy, we're prying, we're very impolite. But it served me well in the quest to understand a bit more about how the world really works. And for me, it's been a kind of an interesting journey in that respect because like most people, you go to school, you have a job, you start to think that the world works in the way that you are told in the theoretical manner that it works, that people follow laws and they follow rules, and you see it happen all around you every day. But as a journalist, the types of people you meet and the types of stories you cover inevitably make you turn a little bit cynical about that theoretical framework for how the world really works. And so for me, the true turning point of that experience was this story called 1MDB. At the time, I was a Wall Street Journal reporter in London, and I had a history in Abu Dhabi, which was a kind of a key location for this scandal. So that's why I was able to join the team and start reporting on it. But throughout the story, I kept thinking that surely this isn't as big as it might seem. So I had this instinct in my gut that was saying it was bigger, but then my brain was telling me there's no way that such a brazen, crazy kind of scandal could occur in our modern world. How is it possible that someone, yeah, exactly, brazen. How in the world could somebody transfer $1 billion and it's actually all stolen through the banking system? This isn't cryptocurrency, this isn't done in, with money couriers walking through airports. This is through the banking system. And eventually I learned that I should deaden that instinct in me that thinks things aren't as bad as they might seem. And you might even have the same feeling about the upcoming US election. Everybody assumed the first time that there was no way that this person could win, and then in fact he did. So just to kind of put this 1MDB scandal into perspective. So 1MDB stands for One Malaysia Development Berhad, which is kind of like the Inc. of Malaysia. And it was a new kind of sovereign wealth fund started in Malaysia. Most sovereign wealth funds, like Norway's, for example, are the savings account of the country, and they use their excess capital to invest and plan for the future. But there's this other species of sovereign wealth fund, which is not very capitalized, in fact. And so One Malaysia Development was created by the Prime Minister of Malaysia as a kind of strategic investment company for the country. And instead of having a savings account, it was borrowing money. So initially it borrowed from Malaysian banks, and eventually it borrowed from international lenders and investors. And this sovereign wealth fund, we now know, was set up from day one to just steal all the money. So eventually, as much as $13 billion went into this fund, and the money they spent on investments was essentially their marketing budget, a few billion just to make it seem like they were doing real things. But in fact, through a series of joint ventures, they were stealing all the money. In some ways, that's the boring part. Stealing money can be quite boring. It's money transferring from one account to another. What is especially interesting about this case is the way in which Joe Low, this young, kind of portly Malaysian guy at the center of the scandal, managed to persuade everyone that it wasn't what it actually was. It wasn't actually a giant fraud. And this is something I think is very applicable for people in your line of work, which is he wasn't even particularly persuasive, but he was very forceful in the way that he did this. So, for example, in the very first theft, they did a joint venture with another company, And on the day that Malaysia was supposed to contribute its money to this joint venture, Jolo submitted some paperwork that said that 700 million of the billion was going to go to this Seychelles company, and 300 million was going to go to the actual joint venture. As you can imagine, the compliance people said, this doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense. Why is 700 million going to a company called Good Star Limited in the Seychelles? And but what's interesting is Jolo had so profoundly controlled this sovereign wealth fund that he was able to fly the entire management team to Switzerland to explain to the compliance department that we had planned this all along. There's a whole reason behind why we're sending $700 million to the Seychelles. And that was the first example of where compliance stood up and said something was wrong, but he was able to overcome it. There's another couple of fun examples where at one point a banker said to 1MDB, or to Jolo in particular, we noticed that you're receiving all this money, you're transferring it to your dad, and then he's transferring it back to you. This feels suspicious. And Jolo responded, how dare you question the ancient Chinese tradition of transferring all your money to your dad, and then he sends it back to you. And of course, I guess they didn't Google that, because it turns out that's not an ancient Chinese tradition. He's like, this is a sign of great respect for my father. I give him the money and then he gives it back to me. And throughout 1MDB, there are so many examples of this where on a dime, on a moment, he was able to persuade people that things weren't what they seemed, you know? And I think, in a way, the interesting kind of lesson about big frauds is that sometimes big frauds are a lot easier than small frauds. So whenever a compliance person saw a transfer of $1 billion or $500 million, they were loath to imagine that this could just be part of a giant criminal conspiracy. And so there's something funny about if you try to send $5,000, that could be a lot harder than sending $1 billion. The other thing about 1MDB is, I think the reason why this is such a persistent, memorable case is how interconnected it is in the world. You know, so that's why I really see it as the story that changed how I view everything, how I look at all events that are happening all around us, and I look at it with this sort of skeptical eye, that there may be a hidden dimension to what's actually happening in front of us. Jolo had this ability to see what people needed and to kind of conjure for them what they needed to see for things to happen. And he also had an ability, this is another good red flag for looking at somebody that might be a financial criminal, is he was so generous with this money that he supposedly had. And when you see people who are that generous, i.e. spending $2 million in a single night at a nightclub, buying everybody in the club champagne 100 times over, that's actually a red flag. The reason is most people are not that willing to spend their own money in that manner, you know? And I think what was special about his ability was his kind of myth-making that he was able to build around himself. And even though it was contradictory, so at one point, there was a public interview with him where he described himself as, no, I'm not the guy at the center of this, I'm just the concierge for the ultra-rich. And then just a few years later, he tried a completely different story where he said, actually, I'm the scion of a multi-billion-dollar generational wealth. My grandfather, I forgot to mention before, was a billionaire, and he had passed it on to me, you know. And the world is so accepting of stories, you know, and of course, there was an incentive to believe Jolo all the time, because if you knew Jolo, if he was here tonight, we would all be having a great time. There'd be people coming out with champagne bottles, with sparklers flying, and we would think this was the greatest night of our life, you know? And everybody had that experience around Jolo. I remember I spoke once to a young woman who was a model at the time that ended up in a limousine with him, and she remarked that it was her birthday, so he pulled the taxi over, the limousine over, went into a watch shop and brought her an $80,000 watch and said, happy birthday. He did this for everybody that was around him. So there's this famous artist that's very inspiring to me called Mark Lombardi. And he was basically the father of the giant relationship maps with all the little faces, or the little names and then the links between them. And his most famous work was called, was around this scandal called BCCI, and it's as big as a wall, and it has on one side Osama bin Laden and George Bush on the other side, and it's really this illustrative thing. And I think that 1MDB would be something very similar, because the way that Jolo used this money really, in a sense, kind of illuminated how the world really works. So, for example, he decided to remake himself as a billionaire, so he used money to kind of create that image. He decided he wanted to access the US White House. He found a way to get money into not only the Obama campaign, but later on the Trump campaign. And he was in the White House. He managed to get inside, and he had access to power, and he just understood. So his money was almost like, what's that thing that they give you? A barium meal. You know, you take it and it illuminates the pathways of your body. He was able to do that with money and the kind of global hidden dimension of the world. And that's why I've been so fascinated. And even to this day, it's been about 9 years since I first started covering this case. And even today, I'm still learning new things all the time, because it was such a complicated story and so illuminating, as I said before, about how things work. Even things like celebrities. Like, I didn't know, maybe I was naive, that it's just as simple as paying money to have a celebrity hang out at your party. But he was spending money. Leonardo DiCaprio, he was in a romantic affair with Miranda Kerr, who's now married to the Snapchat founder. Swizz Beatz, Alicia Keys, Pharrell, Usher, all these people were receiving money from Jolo, and they were, in a way, adding to his mystique, and that mystique allowed him to steal more money, and it was kind of this vicious cycle. But as with all crimes, so the 1MDB scandal, in a nutshell, was lots of money stolen from a sovereign wealth fund, and he went on a global spending spree. Famously, he funded the Wolf of Wall Street movie completely. It was fully funded by stolen money. And there's a great anecdote where I talked to somebody who said they were sitting at a really fancy lunch in New York, and there was Jolo, there was Leonardo DiCaprio, and there was Jordan Belfort. And everyone was watching Jordan Belfort. You know, he was telling these amazing stories of his scam, which in reality was pretty small. And there sitting Jolo was completely quiet. He had pulled off one of the greatest scandals of all time. Like, Jordan Belfort was an amateur compared to him. And not only that, but he had paid Jordan Belfort to give his rights for that movie. Ironically, it was a very successful movie, but none of that money made it back to Malaysia. But so I was saying, 1MDB, steal a lot of money, go on a spending spree. That's kind of the fun part. But the part is always with a crime, it's the cover-up that's always worse than the actual crime. And so what actually happened, this is why the story keeps going and it has so many dimensions, is Jolo ran away as the investigation started. He went to China. And he didn't actually have that many connections in China, even though he's ethnically Chinese from Malaysia. But he began to build up a network in China with the intelligence services. And he came up with an even crazier plan, which was to help cover up the original 1MDB scandal by stealing more money in the form of a huge number of infrastructure projects between China and Malaysia, where, hugely overpriced, and a huge portion of that was going to be recirculated back in to cover up the original scandal. Malaysia was going to give up its sovereignty, essentially, to cover up this scandal. And the Prime Minister was, of course, willing to do it because he believed that his future depended on it. And of course, what happened was there was an election, and the Prime Minister made a cardinal mistake. If you're going to be a kleptocrat, the first rule of thumb is you always stuff the ballot box. If you don't stuff the ballot box, you might lose. And then they might string you up or they might arrest you. And so, ironically, he was too self-confident and believed that he would be reelected, and he wasn't. And that's why we know about some of this stuff. They were this close to becoming a sort of a vassal of the Chinese government. They were going to allow Chinese warships to dock in Malaysia for the first time. They were going to give up pushing back on sovereignty over certain waters around Malaysia. All of this because of a financial scandal. And then, of course, the other additional part was Jolo thought, okay, I got the Chinese plan working, that's good, but now I need to deal with the US government. And he believed very strongly that everything is transactional in this world. And so he came up with an even crazier plan yet to get tons of money into all the people around Trump, from Governor Chris Christie to the top bundler, fundraiser for Trump, Steve Wynn, the casino magnate. All of these people were working for Joe Low. And they all were pushing the same thing to Donald Trump. Get rid of this scandal and it will work out in your favor. So that's why this story is so special. You hear about crimes and financial scams, but very infrequently do they last so long. And does the antagonist of the story have such a cynical but almost sort of psychotic perspective on the world, that everything is transactional. I can make all of this go away if I just move money around this way and that way. So this story for me has really changed everything I do. I'm always very, I guess in a way I've lost some innocence as a result of this. So whenever I see something, I'm starting to think right away that it might not be what it is. Just as an example, I've been looking recently into the Panama Papers, the famous leaked papers. And I now have this growing sensation, based on some reporting which is starting to come out, that Panama Papers leak isn't what it seemed. It wasn't just a good, well-meaning whistleblower, but perhaps something a bit darker. And so that's the world that we have in front of us. We have to be careful. We have to have a kind of investigator's skeptical perspective in order to stop these kinds of frauds from happening. And we probably won't succeed, but it's kind of like being a gardener. You have to just keep, trimming and trying to make it an inhospitable place for the weeds to grow. And so it's good to be both skeptical, but also not too depressed about the state of the world, because ultimately it's a maintenance job. If anybody has any questions, I would love to engage a bit more with the audience, because otherwise I'll just kind of keep rambling. So somebody raise their hand. I'm sure I've got a friend in here who will help me. Okay, the question was, what was the Malaysian Prime Minister's incentive to go along with this? Well, there's a few, actually. One of them was the Malaysian Prime Minister and his wife were very greedy people. Ironically, the Najib family are like sort of the Kennedys of Malaysia. So the father of Najib was this like legendary Prime Minister, Tun Razak, and Najib was one of his sons, obviously. But Tun Razak was famous. There was even an anecdote where the kids were like, hey, you're the prime minister, can we have a swimming pool? And he's like, because I'm the prime minister, you can't have a swimming pool. So he kind of grew up with this sort of strict father. But he married a woman who's famous in Malaysia for being one of the, kind of like Imelda Marcos figures of our time. And so there was greed. There was also a kind of belief that he could separate himself from the very corrupt politics funding mechanism of Malaysia. So it's not, the way politics are funded there was, he considered that if he could have access to a different pool of money, that he could, in a way, clean up Malaysia, ironically. And so that was another reason. Just another remark about Rasma. When they were arrested, they went into her house, they found more than $100 million in cash, and they found an enormous amount of jewelry, none of which she had ever worn in public. So this is jewelry that she had that she could only wear at home, and including 14 tiaras. And I believe that's at least too many tiaras. And also like hundreds of sunglasses. I mean, how do you even have an excuse to have hundreds of pairs of sunglasses? Anyways, so that's why she's kind of like Imelda Marcos. Anybody else? The question is, was the China part Jolo's idea or China's idea? Well, perhaps Jolo's greatest skill was making people think it was their idea, So it blew up in their face in a way. He started off as like the greatest intelligence asset of their time. He was the puppet master of a major state, and he was pulling it into China's orbit and changing its whole perspective. But in the end, it didn't work out because the prime minister got voted out, and then that part got exposed. So right now, the single most embarrassing thing for China's Belt and Road Initiative, where they fund infrastructure around the world, is this particular deal. And so every other country in the world that's about to accept some money from China is like, wait, I heard about in 1MDB you did this and that. Is that what you're doing here? Are you trying to secretly control my country? So probably, and then all the people that were on Jolo's side in China, ironically, are in jail. So it didn't work out for them in the end. He's still in China, though, because nobody really wants Jolo. He's a problem for everyone. He's a problem in Malaysia because he gave money to everybody, including the good guys and the bad guys. And he does not want it in China because he's embarrassing. They don't want to give him to America because they might actually ask him questions about China. And so, in a way, Zhou Luo's lucky to be alive at this point, but somehow he manages to keep going. We only know he's alive because occasionally he sends a legal threat. So the question was, were JVs important for the nature of the crime? So this first JV, he found a company that was run by a prince, a son of the king of Saudi Arabia. It was called Petro Saudi. So it was perfect because it looked like a company, but in reality it was just like a nameplate. They didn't even really have assets. They quickly, when this deal was coming together, they quickly went around and paying tiny option fees on assets, and then they contributed those as their full assets. But it was all part of the illusion because he found very willing co-conspirators in that company. They were like, yeah, we would love to make money for doing nothing, and where do I sign up? And so that's what happened in that case. The part in Abu Dhabi is more complicated, but still pretty much the same. The head of a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi that nobody really ever heard of, called IPIC, was just as corrupt as those two guys at the Petro Saudi. He also wanted to make a lot of money, but he wanted to make a lot more because he was paying for his boss's yacht, which cost $500 million, and even his boss, who was a prince, was really happy to receive that yacht without having to pay for it. Because even princes need money too. They're actually sheikhs and princes, they don't tend to actually have that much liquid cash. They've got a lot of land they inherited from their father or whatever it is. It's hard to turn that into money. If you need to buy a $500 million yacht, it can be a problem, So this is interesting, yeah. So about $7 billion is missing. Some of that money was recovered because Zhou Luo went on this spending spree. He bought the most beautiful house in every city, whether it's New York City, Los Angeles. He bought a lot of assets. So they recovered some of that. They fined Goldman Sachs, the biggest fine ever received. That was a little bit helpful, but the rest of the money is still missing. And Zhou Luo is at large, and perhaps why he's still alive today is he has all this money. And people are thinking, where do I sign up for the subscription, the protection fees, But even there's so much money stolen and so much spent that there's plenty of huge assets that were considered too small to even recover. Though something interesting happening now is Kroll, working on behalf of 1MDB, has been taking over the shell companies one by one and following the money. So they recently sued the not that famous hip-hop artist called Swizz Beatz because he had received, I think, more than $5 million. Swizz Beatz his Wikipedia should say Alicia Keys' husband. But he's really made a career of helping people take money from them and spending it to make them look cool. So he did Zhou Luo, and now his big one is Saudi Arabia. Well, for example, there was a lot of red flags that were raised during 1MDB by people who had a sort of sound mind. So for example, there was a lawyer, an external lawyer for Goldman Sachs, that was looking at the paperwork and said, okay, everything's making some sense. And then it's like, why are you transferring all this money to a private wealth bank in Switzerland? Like, why does 1MDB, a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, do its banking through BSI in Switzerland, which is best known for being where if you're Italian, you drive your money across the border, deposit it in the bank to hide it from the Italians, So I think there were people who raised red flags, but of course everyone was incentivized not to really go much further. Another one for Goldman Sachs is there's this banker who was convicted of a crime, essentially being a huge co-conspirator of it. The guy was a walking compliance nightmare. First of all, he called himself Dr. Timothy Leisner. He bought his doctor from online. It's very easy to find out, And he also had a huge habit of having not only sexual affairs, but also marrying counterparties. So I think it would have been a red flag, but people were sort of looking the other way because the fees were so high. Ooh, that's tough. I don't know. I think the thing is where it will come from is it will be so obvious. It's kind of like Wirecard. Everyone thought, oh, Wirecard can't be complete Potemkin village, but it turned out to be. So I think it's going to be something huge right next to us, and we're not even going to notice it. And I can't predict. I'm sorry to say. I'll just do one last question, if that's okay. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. No, there's a lot coming out right now about how the government of Argentina was being hacked by essentially people that were working for hedge funds that were in a fight with the government of Argentina. And so I have this hunch that the Panama Papers are not a coincidence, because a lot of the financial holdings of the Argentinian government, who were corrupt, were held in these kind of offshore trust kind of offices. So the idea that a random Mossack Fonseca employee decided to leak all the files is starting to look less and less compelling to me personally. So that's my opinion, and we'll see if it's true or not. I guess I have to leave now, but thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.